Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. We were just navigating a little bit of technical issues with our webinar this evening, but we're delighted that you're all here tonight. I'm Katie Christensen. I'm the Curator of Education and Statewide Engagement at the University of Wyoming Art Museum. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. We were just navigating That's the technical glitch. A little Hang bit on of just a second. Issues. All right, friends. So if you have people trying to Facebook Live, Rachel, our curator of academic engagement, is going to post a Zoom link straight to the Facebook page. Send them to Zoom. They might have to download a quick little app to make that happen, but we're having a little technical difficulty with the live streaming to Facebook. So without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and get started this evening. I'm delighted to see folks here, and I want to thank my panelists for joining me tonight, Diana Baumbach and Margery Amdur. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping issues to take care of this evening. So if you are a member of the Art Museum or a patron of the University of Wyoming Art Museum, we want to say a great big thank you. Conversations with Curators is a monthly program. It happens during the academic year, and we chose to do that usually during the lunch hour. It's an informal program and a way to get people into the museum to kind of have quick informal conversations with Q&A. Each month we choose a different exhibition, and there are often special guests during each exhibition focus. So since we're all in this global pandemic, our March conversation and actually April's conversation have been delayed. Margery Amdur is an artist that we brought out to install a work in the exhibition material slip. And we decided to try this version as an evening or a happy hour conversation with cocktails, just to test it out to see how it was going. Margery's trip wasn't able to happen in March, so this is our kind of peace offering during a pandemic, if you will. So a few housekeeping issues tonight. There will be a little survey that pops up when you leave the webinar. It's just 5 or 6 really simple questions, and we'd love to have your feedback. Our programs at the museum are supported by the Wyoming Arts Council with support from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Wyoming Legislature. So your feedback helps us in grant reporting. It also helps us in what we want to kind of provide programming for in the future, both during self-isolation like we're doing now, and hopefully when we get to come back in person and see each other again in the future. Tonight we're on a webinar version. You all are welcome to talk to each other through the chat function. If you hover over below at the bottom, if you're a new user to Zoom, you'll see both a chat box and a Q&A box. So we have a bit of a program to share tonight, and if you would like to ask the artist any specific questions, we're going to ask you to use those in the Q&A function, and I will read them aloud so that everyone can hear those things. If you have questions about technical things, feel free to type those in the chat, and Rachel can help kind of moderate some of those technical issues as well. I want to say a big thank you for Steve Heller for joining us for closed captioning tonight as well. If you need the closed caption function, we are providing that. You should see that at the bottom of your screen this evening. So tonight's program, since we can't be at the museum in person, we have a brief video to show you all this evening. I want to thank Chandra Fletcher, our marketing coordinator at the Art Museum, for putting those videos together. It's a very new task for her, and I think she's done a great job with a pretty steep learning curve. So we'll start with a video, and then Diana Baumbach is a professor at the University of Wyoming Department of Art and Art History. She's going to share a little bit about the context of the overall exhibition, and then a little bit about her specific work. And then we'll end with Margery Amdur sharing her site-specific installation in the exhibition. And we're really lucky, Margery's in her studio tonight, so we'll get to see a little bit of her process as well. So without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and watch the short video, and then I'll hand it over to Diana. So I'm going to share my screen. Before I do that, if you have any trouble with the video, we'll post it in the chat as well, and you can watch it later. The video this evening will also be, we're recording, and we'll post those to both our Facebook pages and YouTube channels, so you can share them closed captioned and watch them later as well. And now, on to the show. So that's just a really brief introduction since we're not able to be in our gallery spaces right now. And I'll turn it over to Diana Baumbach to talk a little bit more about why she proposed and how this exhibition came together.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Katie, and thank you all for coming. I wish I could see you all in person, but it's good to know that you're here joining us tonight virtually. So I wanted to give you a bit of background about the Material Slip exhibition and how it came to be. And to begin, I wanted to just mention that this is the second iteration of this show. So it was initially shown at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and then here. And the two shows, although they had the same artists and have the same artists, were, I don't think any of the, maybe one piece repeated. So it's really been sort of an evolution of this exhibition. And I think that speaks also to the artists in the exhibition, the way that we make work as an iterative process of not just sort of a singular standalone thing, but a sort of continual cycling through of ideas and materials. So this show really began when I connected to Michelle Forsythe, and she and I did a visiting artist swap a number of years ago. I went to Washington State University Pullman, and she came to Wyoming. And while we were here, we were chatting in my studio just about artists that we loved, and artists whose work is sort of in the same vein as what the two of us do. And one person that she kept mentioning was Wendy Kawabata. And at the time I wasn't familiar with Wendy's work, but I think the thing that really linked the three of us together was how all three of us draw upon craft traditions while still moving across media and really calling into question functionality. So the kind of core initial group was me, Wendy, and Michelle, and then it began growing from there. So Wendy then contacted Margery and Josephine, and Michelle also contacted EO, and we've known each other in a number of different ways and capacities. And so the exhibition reflects artists from Wyoming, New Zealand, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, right? Philadelphia, Hawaii, Toronto, and Pullman, Washington. So although we're really widely dispersed around the world, this show has been really satisfying and really fulfilling in the sense that it's provided sort of this web of artists who I feel that we're all like-minded in the types of ideas that we're exploring, and it's created a sense of community in that respect. Because none of our work is really particularly media specific, we don't fit very neatly into particular categories. And I think that that is in fact the thing that kind of binds us together and binds all the work in the show together. So I think that also kind of is a segue into the title of the show. So this idea of slippage between and amongst materials. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes when I talk about my own process. But this idea of sort of defying categories and embracing that lack of categorization. So one thing becoming another. One example that you saw in the video was Wendy's painting of a sort of deconstructed crocheted fragment. So that slippage between painting, well, initially crocheted object, then painting of a crocheted object. And where does that fall, and how do we describe a painting of a thing? So those are some of the things that kind of tie us together. I wanted to also mention that I know you're not able to be at the show right now to see this on the wall, but it was interesting for me to visit the show here in Wyoming for the first time and to see the text that was presented on the wall, because the show is presented to a great extent as a show about textiles, but interestingly enough, there are no textiles in the show. And so I thought that that was an interesting sort of curatorial decision and also comment on the show, the fact that sort of the central leading text speaks about something that is not actually physically there. And I think that that too says something about our work. So although there are no actual like textiles per se in the show, in the sense that there is, you know, no clothing or fabric, we all speak to textiles, I think, in terms of metaphor, representation, raw material, process, materiality, and also through the importance of surface. So hopefully that gives you a general sense of how we all came together and sort of some of the major themes driving the work in the show. And it is a pretty diverse show in some respects. So hopefully that starts to make some of the connections between the different work in the show. So with that, I'll turn it back to Katie to show some more specific examples.
Awesome. It's so helpful to have a little bit of background and context. I know whenever work kind of has that iteration, it's fun to see the evolution, and you get to see this kind of thread of process in there as well. So I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, and it does start with Diana, but Margery, if you want to chime in at any point, please feel free. So the PowerPoint is just another way to be able to see the work itself. So I will share my screen and we'll start from there. So this is another installation shot. This is one of the small galleries in the museum space. It's South 2. And we're looking at the back of Josephine's piece, and you see over on the right the door, the opening to the gallery space. And then Diana, I'll let you talk, and when you're ready, you can just say next slide and I can forward things.
Okay, perfect. So really before I talk about these pieces specifically, I wanted to take a moment to sort of provide some larger context about my working process and what kind of drives the work. So I think that one thing that's really central to my practice is this idea that materials carry meaning and that artists can then communicate through materials, drawing upon material history, personal history, and cultural meaning. And that plays a really big role in the work in this show, as well as my practice in general. So I wanted to begin by talking about the materials. And as you can see, or you can possibly see on your screen, this piece called First and Last is made from a number of things, but I think the material that maybe stands out the most is that it's made from deconstructed onesies. So I wanted to describe that process. So I have 2 children, and my youngest child is about to turn 4, but as I was making this piece, it was really a time of sort of moving beyond that very early childhood stage of care. So it was sort of a literal cutting up of that baby stage. So I went through and collected, of course you collect a lot of stuff as a parent, and I collected all of my kids' onesies from when they were little, and I cut them up into teeny tiny pieces, and then I processed those pieces in a Hollander beater. So basically it breaks down the fibers really slowly. In this case, it was like a very, very slow process because of the nature of this particular fabric. So it slowly broke down the fibers into a sort of pulp. And I think that this processing and deconstructing of these objects that held so much significance to me as a parent, you know, it's a thing that my children wore, touched their bodies, and it just kind of elicited so many powerful memories for me by like literally cutting it up and processing it and turning it into this sort of frothy pulp. It was, in a sense, sort of a cathartic letting go of that stage and a cycling through of, you know, the different stages of our lives. So from there, I turned this pulp into paper. So it went from clothing that was worn to paper. And then I made it a very thick paper so that I could then manipulate the paper and mold the paper into the shapes, the 3-dimensional shapes that I wanted. And if you hear screaming or anything in the background, I apologize. That is in fact my 2 children that inspired this piece. So I worked with this circular motif that I've used a lot in my work. It's sort of a way of marking time and measuring time, referring to cyclical processes in life and nature, also things like the rings on a tree. With each ring, I like to think of it as a process of recentering myself. And what you kind of get a sense from in looking at this piece, but much more so in person, is just how important the role of light is in this work. So as depending on lighting conditions and situations, the piece can sort of look very dramatically different. And I like to, and actually we can go back, we can stick on this for just a minute. In fact, can you go back 2 slides really quickly? Okay, perfect. So I like to allow light and shadow to play an important role in my work as well. So for a number of years, I had been making these pieces that had radial symmetry, and I started a number of years ago pairing them together like this in 2s. And it was, the more I looked at them and thought about this impulse, I started to realize like, oh, they kind of look like eyes, they kind of look like breasts, they kind of look hypnotic in a way, which really describes the way that I felt, you know, as a nursing mom, like eyes wide open, kind of losing my mind at certain points in time. And so, and I was interested in all of those references that this sort of pairing made. And for this piece in particular, I was interested in sort of breaking into the space of the viewer and occupying that space. So these woolen elements that come physically out from the frame, they're sort of suspended by the frame, go onto the floor into the space of the gallery. And these 2 are meant to reference a sort of umbilical cord or a flowing of milk, or just kind of being tied or tethered to something else, which was also a feeling that I had and probably still have to a great extent. And this idea of, yeah, just being tethered to another person. So if you can go forward a couple slides to the next piece, Katie, thank you. Yeah, and so it's kind of tricky to see in this piece, but this was also made using that same paper, and it was just cut into circles and stacked so that it became a sort of almost like a tube that goes around and around like a pulley. And in this piece, I was thinking about gears, sort of a softening of gears, this act of being pulled upon, and the cyclical process of going around and around and around. Again, thinking about how these materials can carry meaning and communicate something to the viewer. And wool, I think, too, is important in this piece because it has a sort of bodily quality. You know, it comes from a living thing, and it is, you know, it provides protection, warmth, comfort, and it's also uncomfortable at times too. It's kind of both, you know, comforting, but also itchy and scratchy. And so thinking about these sorts of dualities. And then if you go to the next slide, this piece is essentially like a core sample. And it's meant to be kind of like a sample of like, I guess of my process, sort of like taking a core of all of the materials and processes that I had been using in this body of work. And you'll notice that a lot of each of these little discs, which are just stacked on top of each other, a lot of these processes are very slow and repetitive and methodical. So for instance, there's wool in this piece too, but it's needle felted. So just this really simple basic act or gesture of moving the hand up and down over and over, or there are sort of like paper bits that are glued and fused together, this small cutting gesture, or like I sanded each of these wooden pieces, so this kind of back and forth sanding gesture. And I think that for me, there's something interesting about slow incremental movements or marks or gestures that seen collectively have potentially great impact, but seen on their own are really meaningless, absurd, or just so small that they might not be noticed. So like a single pinprick really doesn't have any effect, but by repeating that and kind of laboring over that and doing it over and over, it can create a thick sort of solid mass. And I think that that speaks to my process. I tend to work in more of a continuum rather than like, okay, here's one piece, it's a standalone thing and it's done. And then I'm going to move on to the next piece. I don't really work in that vein as much as I tend to have a lot of overlapping things and happening simultaneously. And one piece, hopefully, generally, tends to feed and inform what happens next. And I also frequently go back and revisit work, taking it apart, rethinking it, using the pieces in new ways. So this idea of materials that I'm working with having multiple lives and not necessarily being fixed. So although it might seem like my work is quite precious, it in fact is not, or it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels, again, like it's kind of in flux and living and yeah, and could continue on in a new iteration in the and hopefully will in the future in some respects. So I think that's all I really wanted to say about the work that I have in the show here. I have another piece from this same body of work in a show at Site Brooklyn right now, and it's called Craft and Contemporary Art. And I think that they have done a nice job of making that public and visible as well. So if you'd like to see more work from this series, you can Google that as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Diana. And maybe that's something that if you are able, you could post in the chat for people as well. Just a thought, if it's possible. If not, Googling is always an option. A couple of thoughts came to mind as we were talking. Yeah. And because you are and Margery are both really process-based, and you're not in the studio right now.
Yeah.
What's happening for you?
Yeah, so as Katie mentioned, I work at UW and my studio is on campus, and the campus is closed at the moment. So I've had to really pretty dramatically rethink my working process. And that's taken two pretty distinct directions. The first is I've been making a lot of work that deals with this idea of marking time, almost like a daily record of time spent or not spent, which is really reminiscent of a number of pieces I made after the birth of my first son. So this idea of slow daily gestures that on their own are really hardly anything, but I feel like this, being where we are today, it's this idea of like, okay, we can just kind of barely make it through the day, and that's kind of enough, and this sort of daily gesture gives me some direction. So in a minute I can pull things out and show you guys at the very end what those are looking like. I have that very process-oriented work that I'm making at home. It's small, and then I'm also doing a project digitally on Instagram, where it's basically like a daily invitation for other people to participate and contribute in finding just circles in your daily environment. And this was an idea that came about from playing with my kids and just kind of going on circle hunts and really thinking about our everyday environments and looking at them in new ways, or just looking more closely at them. And so it's on Instagram, it's at spot dot. So it's basically this idea of spotting a dot and then posting it there. So it's just a series of hundreds of circles that I've found, and my kids of course have found. And then it's also become a communal project in the sense that anyone can make submissions. So each day I try to kind of have a balance of submissions from other people and then things that my kids and I have found as well. And it's been a really nice way of just checking in with people. So as people send me images, it's a really lovely moment to just stop and like say hi and just see how that person is doing, or to meet someone new. I've had a number of people say hi and send submissions and connect people that I would never have met otherwise. So I've got the sort of very virtual work happening and very tactile physical work, and neither of which probably would have ever happened if not for these circumstances.
Great. Thanks, Diana. You saw a toddler timeout just a second ago, so thank you for just rolling with the punches. And I do love that a couple folks have mentioned your Instagram in the chat. It's worth checking
Oh, I haven't
out
looked.
as well.
Oh.
If you follow Diana, it's a way to keep the art practice and process going. I think as artists, we don't turn off even in global pandemics, even though we don't have studio spaces. So it's nice to see that your practice continues. The next images in the PowerPoint are actually artists who are not on the webinar tonight, but it's a nice way to be able to see them a little closer than the video that did go a little quickly. So I'm gonna, for the sake of time, I think I just had a time check, go through these also a little quickly. We will be posting a version of this to our website and Facebook pages. So if you feel like we're rushing through these artists, we should schedule another one of these with more artists perhaps, but we're gonna get to Margery in just a second. But if Diana, you wanna chime in with any of these other artists since you helped kind of put the show together, please do.
Yeah. I just wanted to really briefly mention that this work is actually meant to be interactive. These pieces are meant to be worn and played with, which I don't think probably hasn't happened that much at the museum. I don't know if it's been encouraged, but it's interesting to think about the difference between the intent of the artist and then the reality of display of work.
Yeah, definitely. Diana and I did put together an interactive space outside of this exhibition, but in the Wyoming gallery. So if you're familiar with our museum, it's the small space just as you enter the door. It was inspired by works in this exhibition. So that has been kind of put on and worn more than the formal gallery space has, Diana. So another installation view of Josephine's work. It's really fun because in here there are also hands. So there are multiple hands that you kind of find throughout, and she's playing with body and form and garment in really interesting ways as well. We teach all ages at our museum, so it's really delightful to use this space as sort of like a scavenger hunt, and littles find all sorts of things that I don't see in this piece. So do you want to add anything else, Diana? Okay. So Michelle Forsythe is another artist using textile, but these are actually digital prints with screen print over the top of them. So very flat, even though they're three-dimensional objects, they're super slick and super flat on the surface.
And I should just note that Michelle likes to move back and forth between bundling like her actual clothing and then recreating, so like reknitting or reweaving reproductions of her clothing, and then also playing with you know, what is real and what is not real. So the shadows are painted, the objects are, there's the real object, and then there's the recreation of the object that she made. There's the surface, varying degrees of surface happening within this work. So it's kind of hard to see here, but there are a lot of different layers happening.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the difficulty with translating to the virtual realm when they're playing with that anyway. So this is Wendy. She's in Hawaii, and these are exquisite drawings up close. I don't think the virtual digital versions of them are quite as lovely in person. So if you are able to come when the museum reopens, which we're talking about as we speak as a team, deciding when the museum will open, I hope you can come see these in person, because the surface, the drawing quality is actually really matte. And they're really great to see up close and in person. Quite meditative. I like that's the thread that's kind of connecting the work as well. You talked a lot about meditative process in your own practice, Diana.
Not to plug Instagram again, but I will say that Wendy does a really amazing job of sharing her process on Instagram, which I find really interesting to see. You know, she actually starts by working observationally for those pieces. So if you're interested in seeing more of her process, she shares it, which is really generous.
Cool. So this is an installation shot, and when you proposed this work, it looked very different. It had kind of its own structure and armature, and then this was a new iteration of the work.
Yeah.
So here's some detail shots. It does come off the wall, so this is kind of looking at the side of the work. You can see the depth and the shadows that are created with this piece. And then this is just a contextualizing piece. You can see in the gallery space the proximity of Eo's work and then Margery's work. So we'll go next to Margery, and you can see this is Blind Sight in its full glory. I'll turn it over to Margery in just one second. Unless, Margery, do you want to start talking now and we can go through the details as you talk?
Go ahead, say what you were, and then I'll, I'm not sure how you were leading into it or where I should pick up. So did you have something?
I was just going to talk a little about, Margery came in January to Laramie into the art museum, and she brought suitcases with her. She brought pieces that were sort of completed, and you can see in her screen now on her studio on the wall, she brought some of those things. She brought lots of small components, and I think in her mind she had a little bit of a plan, but as any working artist knows, all good plans can change at any moment. And there were points in Margery's installation that you would walk in, and later that afternoon or the next day you would walk in and it was totally changed. The whole thing was different. So this is the final iteration or installation of Blind Spot as we see it in Laramie. Here are some details of the piece. And it's great because from a distance, you don't notice the materials that are in the work, but as you start to get up close, you see little cut apart makeup sponges, you see paper art straws that have been constructed, you see other little globes, and I'm sure Margery will talk a little bit more about material with some of these things as well. So I'll let you take it away, Margery. Talk a little bit about this piece and also your process.
Thank you. And again, I'm honored to be part of the exhibition, both when we were in Hawaii and now in Laramie. And I so enjoyed spending time with Nicole and Diana and both women here in the middle of not knowing what I was doing. You know, they would say, you need to take a break and have lunch and come back to it. But so the piece that I originally thought I was going to install in this exhibition was also going to be an iteration of a piece a couple months earlier I had shown in Istanbul. And I shipped a lot of work, and I showed up with suitcases full of stuff. And so I went to, the rest of the show had been installed, and I was shown where my area was. And the show actually felt quite full at the time. And so I went to install, I had been working on this with parachute material, which is very strong material, and that's what people actually are using for making murals, exterior and interior murals. And the materials you see here are partially the parachute materials. Anyway, I was supposed to be using them as backdrops, kind of setting a stage or context for my work. And I had been putting them up with Velcro. So I started to do that, and I did not have a good feeling about the installation at that point, but a lot of times you have to go through several days or at least hours looking at something and giving it time to have it percolate. Anyway, that evening I went back to the hotel, and the next morning I came in with Nicole, the curator, who I did not really know, and the piece had fallen off of the walls. So it was not a happy camp, to say the least. However, I will say that there were a lot of Velcro dots on the walls. That's what remained. And it just started to, I had the sense like there's something there. There's something there. And I always tell my students, stay open to things while you're working that are part of the process that you might call a mistake. However, they can be very important moments in terms of exploration and leading into other bodies of work. But what you need to know are these dots were supposed to be used as a language, as in Braille. So I was using them basically, my work, the undercurrent of my work is from the yellow wallpaper. A lot of times, it's been for years, at least a part of it. And we don't have enough time for me to go into it, but basically there is a quote from the main character. There are things in that wallpaper, but nobody knows but me or ever will. The images grow stronger every day. So that has resonates and has a lot of different layers of meaning for me. And so I took that quote and I translated it into Braille, and that Braille was supposed to go onto the wall, as you would have a sense of trying. You couldn't read them. Sighted people would not be able to read the quote, which is part of, I wanted that struggle, but it was there would be a sense of language inherent in the piece, but not a direct narrative. So, so as you can see, the piece became much more about cosmology and mapping and kind of this, like this big event, and a pool of energy is one of the things I read between the work. Unfortunately, because I didn't get to come back to Laramie, the piece happened in a few days and I left. So I didn't really have time to get my body and it fully. So in a certain respect, I'd see these forms also as almost embellishments. If they were miniature, they could be almost pieces of jewelry that have been exploded. My materials, I would say my language is texture, and the materials that I had been working with for the past 5 to 7 years has been the cosmetic sponge. I usually have like a material of choice for every 5 or 7 or so many years that I stumble onto, and it becomes like my main character. So the cosmetic sponge is an everyday throwaway object that women use many times for putting on makeup. However, interestingly enough, I never really did use a cosmetic sponge to put on makeup. But when I would make the work, I would glue thousands and thousands of cosmetic sponges onto canvas. And when they hung flat, they would feel architectural. And when I would install them on the wall, it became kind of an intersection of landscape and nature. After 5 years of gluing 15 million trillion sponges onto canvas, I needed to have a little bit of sense of something moving a little faster or spontaneously. So what has happened now is I'm not making a 360-degree turn from the sponges, but I'm starting to take the sponges off and deconstruct the piece. Unlike Diana, who said she has done that many times in her career, I'm the oldest of this bunch. So at this point in my career, I had never done that before. So it's kind of, you spend all these hours and days and years making these things, and now I'm literally tearing them off and cutting them into pieces to reconstruct things I don't know. And what I found, I think the interesting thing it seems like now at this point in my career, when I do an installation, it's yes, it is the work that's the I go to present and why I'm selected to participate, but it's really the event, the opportunity to converse and see how it is that we as artists or people who view the show make meaning in our lives and how everybody else makes meaning. And I think I understand the world better. I need to manifest things visually or physically to understand myself in the world. And maybe it's because I don't have children, like Diana said, but creating this kind of piece is an opportunity then to have these kinds of conversations and celebrations. The other thing, so it's hard when I'm usually used to giving a lecture when, there's a lot of different works and, I'm moving along and looking at different things. One of the things I think that I wanted to say, not only about my work, but kind of what was
Margery, you froze up a little bit.
In the room, is that I think there's a sense of silence. Pardon me?
Oh, you just froze up a little bit. I was going to have you pause and go back just a little bit. I think we heard sense of silence.
Can you?
Sorry.
I guess what I was going to say, instead of when I'm trying to read between the lines in terms of what might be said about our work, and then how our work ties together, and what are the threads that aren't necessarily as obvious. And I think the artists in the show were all very busy. Like Diana said, even though they might be these little moments of twisting or turning or gathering or knitting or whatever, there's still a busyness, and our hands kind of are, we need to be involved with our hands and our body. And I think, however, when the work gets finished, there's a sense of peace and calm. And so I think there's a tension in all of our works, if I can be so bold, where there's a friction or a tension between this busyness and then something that also looks like a meditation. And that's one of the things I felt very substantially when I was in the show. The other thing I know for my work personally, when I was working with just the cosmetic sponges, is that when I would put these big installations up, because cosmetic sponges, they silence the space. So you could walk by a big piece and you could feel sounds kind of like go dead. There was something. So people who know me know that I'm a lot about stuff. I don't think anybody in the show would say, we're not minimalist by any stretch of the imagination. So for me, that also is interesting, that it's all a lot of stuff. And then when it gets installed, there's a quietness. Since I don't know time-wise how we're doing, or I'm doing.
You probably have a couple more moments, and then if folks are thinking about questions, you can start to type those questions in the Q&A box, and we'll transfer over to questions in just a couple more minutes, Margery. But I love what you're thinking about, kind of threading the works together right now. So please continue.
So also, this is a time of pause in a way, that this period that we're going through. And I thought it would be a pretty cool idea to give my students this assignment to write a fairy tale about paradise lost, paradise regained, given that it's this time that we're going, the pandemic, and that we're all living through. I think this work that we're doing that you're seeing in the show is, you're hearing Diana say and myself say that there is this sense of pause. There is something that happens when we slow down, and we are forced to do that now, like in the real world. So the whole notion of alone together is pretty profound. And so again, I think this alone together is something that's inherent in the artists in this show. We spend a lot of time in our studios, whether it's a pandemic or it's paradise and people are running to the beach, and we're there twisting and turning in our materials. Yet we also want to share them and the stories that go with them with others. I do think it's also important that we, to be an abstract artist today is not all that sexy. So you're also looking at work and a show that's is abstraction. And people could say this work is just about materials. I think materials are the chemistry. They ignite us and they do carry meaning. I think all of us create narratives, but it's much more from a felt narrative. That's one thing I say a lot of times about myself, that there's emotion underneath a lot of all of our work. And I think that, so I just quickly will, and I go back and forth between black and white, and I don't have that much more time, but it's like, so the work is about, again, gathering stuff and taking it on site and then seeing what happens. And I know in the past 3 installations I've done, even though I've worked on pieces that go to a location and are supposed to be made for a specific site, I have shown up on site and I've had to like rethink the piece right away. I mean, there's something about, oh my God, this has happened now 3 times. And I guess what I'm wondering is that actually the content of the, very important in the piece at this point in my life? That kind of like challenge, showing up and having to pull things together. So this did again happen in Wyoming. These are my cast of characters, but they built an environment, or I built an environment with them that I had not ever experienced before. So that's that. And then I did have, I don't know, again, this whole thing of showing things on a computer. I'm now working in my, you guys have to tell me.
I think if I stopped sharing my screen, Margery, so folks should be able to.
So you're gonna have to direct me in terms of, like, does that, I don't know. Are you seeing the work?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, see, I see a little picture up in the top. So I don't know, you'll have to, if I do, I can't tell. Does this do anything or not?
We're getting a little closer. I think for the sake of time, what I might do, Margery, is open it up for questions. So if anyone in the webinar audience has a specific question, you can type it into the Q&A box that can be found at the lower part of your screen. And if not, maybe we can start with questions of each other. And I think there were some things that were kind of alluded to. And Diana, you look like you might be.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject really quickly that, it was really interesting to hear Margery talk about how maybe the amassing of things and the putting yourself in these situations where you have to make and not necessarily having a direction, like that being at the core of what you're doing now. I think that was so amazing for me to watch because I do the same thing, but I don't do it publicly. And you talked in the moment, you talked about feeling really vulnerable. And I can only imagine how that would feel. And I think that that's amazing to be able to allow yourself to have that experience and to share that with others, because it was really amazing to watch you just be willing to do that. And I think most artists, that's scary. That's really, really scary. So it was just, from my perspective, really amazing to see you go through that whole process.
Thank you for, thank you for sharing that. It's not that I choose, until just thinking now in the past brief period of time that maybe there is something there to allow myself to actually get to a site and not know. it is such an uncomfortable feeling. And it's like, oh my God, am I not going to be able to do it? But I do think my work, whether it's personal struggles or struggles at a location, that my work is really about overcoming obstacles. And I would say a lot of the content in my work is behind the work. So the actual work that we see, it's almost like a skin, and the energy is behind that skin or armor or.
Yeah.
So.
Diana,
So.
Margery, I think you froze.
Oh, okay.
We do have a question from the audience for Diana. This is from Nicole, and she asks, how did your kids experience witnessing you deconstruct their clothes? Did they understand what the process was and what that was meaning for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I don't think it really made sense, that actual process of cutting things up. I don't think that really registered, but they were really curious about the whole paper making process. And so while I don't think they like made the connection like, oh, you're cutting up our stuff, like, why are you doing that? I don't think that really necessarily registered in a meaningful way, but they watched me do it and watched the paper making process and, you know, put their hands in the pulp and were kind of grossed out and curious by it. And so that led to thinking about other ways that we could work together to harvest materials and generate materials. So after they saw me do that, the next summer we gathered flax from our property and processed that together and turned that into paper. So it kind of led to something else. I think that they're just so young that the content of that didn't really register, but they were curious. There was like a curiosity there. And so I think that idea of then them taking the lead or having more of a hand in the process was an interesting next step or follow-up that came from that.
I guess I'm wondering too, like Diana, what do you think that it's an all women show? That's the whole notion of gender, you know, and inclusivity, or, you know, if we do this again, do we want to stay kind of also in this context, how important that is? You know, it's just something I'm kind of.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I personally don't think it needs to, or maybe should be, an all-female show. I don't know. I think it would be exciting to see more diversity amongst the artists. I think that, I don't know, for all of us, there is a very personal sort of aspect to the content of the work, but I think that diversity or just different points of view can only add to the richness of that. But I don't know. What about you?
Well, it's interesting because given also that I am a bit older, at a certain point in my career, and I don't know if you felt this way, it was really important that I was known as a woman artist, you know, and it was not okay if I was just a successful artist. It was like it was a woman. And over the years, and obviously time passes and things happen.
Oh, Margery, you cut out. Margery, are you still with us?
Slip. It becomes more like the slip under a garment. Oh, did I freeze?
You froze a little bit. Yeah. Sorry. It was over the years as a woman.
Oh, well, again, like asking the whole issue of being a feminist artist, and younger generations, they don't want to call themselves feminists at all. At this point, I don't need to be known as, when I was younger, as a woman artist. I don't have that need. In the same respect, I think there are legacy gifts and legacy burdens of being a woman. And I think that that's what we would have to possibly think about if we expanded this to not just be women, or brought in different kind of minorities. Like what is the lineage that we're bringing down and extending? But I think there's just a lot of room to grow this.
I think that's such an interesting question. You know, I think, Diana, you talked a little bit about craft being important to all the work and all the artists as well. And in my mind, craft is often a traditional women's work, but not always. And it came up, we have a companion exhibition on view at the museum right now called Material Tradition, and it's textiles from our collection. And a lot of those are women artists. Many of them are anonymous because they were craftspeople from other indigenous cultures and things. It came up that there's a piece, I think it's is it a Hopi kilt? Traditionally woven by men, though. And so it just brought up a lot of questions about that gendered notion. And it has come up with patrons to the museum asking those questions as well. So I think it's important to ask, especially, you know, in the text panel in the exhibition space, we have pictures and it's 6 women. So it does come up. And so I think it's an interesting perspective to hear both of your points of view there.
Would we see an exhibition that was just 6 men? I mean, I don't know anymore. Do you know what I mean? Or if you're on a panel discussion, you aren't going to see just 6 men either. There would be something wrong with.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. There's a couple other comments and questions. So one comment is, Margery, I'm really grateful to see your process, even when it is changing at the last minute. That's really inspiring to see. And I think it can feel so uncomfortable to be vulnerable like that. So thank you for addressing that. And Nicole, thank you for that comment. Tessa wants to know, she read that Margery often works with students to create her pieces collaboratively. Is the piece at the University of Wyoming Art Museum a departure from her usual process? Is the piece at UM collaborative? Margery, do you want to tackle that one? She may have frozen again.
How do I pause the piece?
Oh, Margery, timeout. I think you froze.
Hello?
There we go. Try it again.
Oh, no. Okay. Because the piece now is different generations, I would say the piece has one of the things about being collaborative is I feel that there are stories told while making the piece, and those stories stay within the piece as the piece travels forward, right? So that I bring with me. Then while I was so fortunate while I was in Wyoming, and I'm so embarrassed that I forget the young woman who helped me. I adored her, and I'm just drawing a blank on.
Clara?
She worked with me for 3 days and with me in my vulnerability to the last second. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So I didn't have a whole team of people working with me, but I.
Oh no.
Margery, you froze again.
Helped me until the end. I don't know. I don't know. Like if I'm talking and things are.
That's okay. I think we're starting to get a little glitchy at the end. The student's name was Clara Reese, and she was actually an assistant at the Art Museum at the time and did a wonderful job assisting Margery in the process.
So, and this happens, another thing happens, that I meet these perfect people. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Totally okay. I think we're actually just about at our time. I just want to share, I think I have one last closing thought. It's been such a delay. I think I've learned that I need to schedule these things for longer because we were just warming up into the conversation and things by the end. But I wanted to share this final slide, just acknowledging that the exhibition and this performance, this webinar this evening was sponsored and made possible by the Lucille Wright Endowment, the University of Wyoming Art Museum, the Wyoming Arts Council through the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Wyoming State Legislature. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Margery and Diana tonight, to all the attendees who were able to make it to the webinar this evening. We're going to be posting their email addresses. If you have further questions, they have offered very, very generously to answer questions via email. I'm also happy to answer questions. And don't forget about our social media channels. The Art Museum is doing great work, we hope great work at sharing some of the things when we can't come to the galleries and in person. Special thanks to museum staff, Rachel Cook, our academic curator, Chandra Fletcher, our marketing coordinator, Steve, our captioner tonight, and Nicole Crawford, the chief curator who helped bring the exhibition to the University of Wyoming. So please be well, stay healthy wherever you are in the world, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.